Germany, 1919. A nation humiliated, its economy shattered, its pride buried under the ashes of the Great War. Among the angry crowds stood a restless man, a failed painter turned soldier, Adolf Hitler. He found in chaos an opportunity, and in hatred, a voice. Through fiery speeches, he promised a wounded people revenge, rebirth, and glory. His words were poison wrapped in hope, and millions drank it eagerly. By 1933, Hitler's rise was complete. The swastika flew over Berlin, and the world watched a new Germany march in perfect rhythm. Factories roared, armies trained, and children grew up saluting their Führer. But behind the parades lay fear, propaganda, and the silent disappearance of anyone who dared to think differently. Hitler dreamed of empire, not just power, but domination. He looked east to Poland, west to France, south to Africa. In 1939, his army rolled into Poland, and the world plunged into the Second Great War. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, changed everything. Cities fell in weeks, nations surrendered in days. The dictator believed himself unstoppable, but power built on fear cannot last forever. Hitler underestimated the will of free nations and the strength of his enemies. The skies over Britain filled with German bombers, yet Britain did not fall. Then, in his arrogance, he turned toward the Soviet Union, opening a front that would drain the lifeblood of his army. As winter froze his soldiers outside Moscow and Stalingrad burned his dreams to ash, the thousand-year Reich began to crumble. Inside his bunker, surrounded by ruins, Hitler faced the truth he had denied the world, that his empire was finished. The man who promised greatness brought only destruction. On April 30th, 1945, the Führer ended his own life, and with him ended the nightmare he created. When the guns finally fell silent, Germany lay in ruins, and the world counted the cost. Tens of millions dead. Adolf Hitler's name became a symbol of evil, a reminder of how one man's hatred can consume nations. His rise was built on anger, his fall on arrogance. And in his story, the world learned a truth that still echoes through history. No empire born of hate can ever stand. In the spring of 1940, as German tanks rolled across Europe, Britain stood alone. France had fallen, Poland had vanished, and the Nazi flag flew from the Channel to the Black Sea. The world held its breath. In this hour of despair, a single man rose from political exile, Winston Churchill. He was not young, not popular, and not easy to follow. But he had one weapon that no enemy could silence, his words. Standing before Parliament, cigar in hand and fire in his eyes, he promised not comfort, but courage. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. When the Luftwaffe filled the skies and London burned in the Blitz, Churchill refused to hide. He walked the bombed streets, comforting civilians amid the ruins. His voice, broadcast through crackling radios, gave strength to a frightened nation. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight in the fields, we shall never surrender. These were not mere speeches, they were lifelines. Every night, German bombers turned cities into firestorms, but Britain endured. The Royal Air Force fought like lions, outnumbered yet unbroken. Behind them stood a leader who never doubted victory, even when defeat seemed certain. Never in the field of human conflict, he said, was so much owed by so many to so few. Churchill's genius was not only in words, but in will. He forged bonds across oceans, reaching out to President Roosevelt in America and Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. It was Churchill who held the Allies together, balancing pride, politics, and power. He understood that victory would not come from strength alone, but from unity and spirit. As D-Day approached, Churchill's dream took shape. The tide was turning, and Britain, once on the brink of invasion, now became the staging ground for liberation. When Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy, his voice echoed once again, "This is your victory." By 1945, when the guns fell silent, Churchill stood as the symbol of resistance, the man who had faced the storm and refused to bend. Yet victory brought irony. Soon after the war ended, the people he saved voted him out of office. But history would not forget. Winston Churchill became more than a politician. He became a legend, a man of words and will who lit a candle in humanity's darkest night. His legacy reminds us that sometimes courage speaks loudest not through the sword, but through the voice that refuses to surrender. In the vast frozen plains of the Soviet Union, another giant awoke, one born not from democracy or freedom, but from fear and iron. His name was Joseph Stalin, the man who ruled with an unshakable grip, whose word was law, and whose enemies vanished in the night. When World War II reached his doorstep, Stalin faced a nightmare that even his cruelty could not control. In June 1941, Hitler broke his pact with the Soviet Union and unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history. Millions of German troops stormed across the border, crushing Soviet divisions, capturing cities, and driving deep into Russian soil. The Red Army collapsed, and Stalin, for the first time, was silent. But only for a moment. Then came his command. Not one step back. Factories were dismantled and moved east. Entire cities were evacuated, and every man, woman, and child was ordered to fight. The price was unimaginable, but Stalin's will was absolute. He ruled through terror, yet in that terror, he forged resistance. The turning point came at Stalingrad, the city that bore his name. For months, German and Soviet soldiers fought house to house, street to street, in one of the bloodiest battles ever fought. The winter froze the rivers and the living alike. But the Soviets held, surrounding and defeating an entire German army. The myth of Nazi invincibility shattered in the snow. From that moment, Stalin's armies pushed west, reclaiming one city after another. Soviet banners rose over the ruins of Kiev, Warsaw, and finally, Berlin. It was the Red Army that reached the Reichstag first, ending Hitler's empire and bringing victory to the east. Yet even in triumph, Stalin's shadow grew darker. He saw the West not as allies, but as future rivals. His occupation of Eastern Europe marked the beginning of a new struggle, the Cold War. Behind the celebrations of victory lay a continent divided by ideology, barbed wire, and mistrust. Stalin's leadership saved his nation from annihilation, but at a terrible cost. Tens of millions dead, both in war and under his rule. He turned a desperate people into a war machine, and a devastated land into a superpower. But the same iron will that won the war would later forge a cage of fear that held his people for decades. In the end, Stalin stood as both savior and tyrant, the man who broke Hitler's armies, yet built his own empire of silence. His legacy remains a paradox of history, brutal, relentless, and unforgettable. The guns of World War II fell silent, but its echoes never died. 4 men, Hitler, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, had reshaped the world in their image. And though their time has passed, the consequences of their choices still define our age. These were not just leaders, they were forces of destiny, the architects of war, the shapers of peace, and the makers of the modern world.